We call this evening program A Conversation with Holland Cotter. Participating in the conversation is another extremely distinguished leader of our field, Dr. Vishakha Desai. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about her in case you have not read about her. I'm sure all of you have. Certainly. Dr. Desai is the president and the CEO of Asia Society, which is a leading global organization committed to strengthening partnerships among the people, leaders, and institutions of Asia and the United States. As Jack pointed out, it was founded by John D. Rockefeller III in 1956. Asia Society is a premier organization with a unique focus on three-dimensional engagement, which are combined culture, commerce, and current affairs, with more than 35 countries in Asia. Vishakha was appointed president in 2004. She sets the direction of the Society's diverse set of programs ranging from major U.S.-Asia policy initiatives and the National Educational Partnership for Global Learning, to path-breaking art exhibitions and innovative Asian American performances. And prior to her assumption of the president, she was first started to work at Asia Society in 1990 as the director of the museum, then as a vice president, and then as senior vice president. Dr. Desai holds a BA in political science from Bombay University and an MA and a PhD in Asian art history from University of Michigan. She received numerous international and national grants and fellowships, honorary degrees, and awards. She is a world traveler, certainly. Frequent speaker at national and international forums on a wide range of subjects pertaining to Asia. She has so many wonderful achievements, I will name you but a few. For example, during her tenure, she oversaw a major expansion of the New York headquartered Asia Society, with establishment of new offices in India and South Korea. Today, Asia Society's global reach extends across 11 cities in Asia and the United States. This expansion culminated in the opening of two new architecturally important multi-million-dollar centers with gallery spaces in Hong Kong and in Houston. Vishakha, just a few days ago on May the 9th, announced her plan to retire from Asia Society. But retire is not really the right word. She's embarked on a new adventure, maybe several new adventures, one of which is to serve as a senior consultant to the Guggenheim for global policy and programs. She's also in conversation with several universities to develop a special initiative focusing on the intersection of culture in international relations. She's also writing a book about the future of India's role in the world through the prism of her life stories. So we are distinguishedly honored by Vishakha's presence along with Holland Cotter. So without further ado, I will ask Vishakha to start with the first question of our conversation.
Thank you, Jay. And have a seat. Thank you.
Oh, by the way, from time to time, I will look at my BlackBerry, not check email. Just want to make sure we leave time for your questions. So think along the questions you want to ask, okay? Yeah.
First of all, let me just say what a thrill it is for me to be here. What Jay didn't say is the only reason I'm here is really because of the Asia Society. We started doing contemporary art long before anybody else was doing it, and Holland had a lot to do with writing about those first things. As early as in 1992, 93, and then when we did the exhibition. So my first question is really going back to that journey of the last 2 decades. I recall the first piece you did on the exhibition we did, Traditions, Tensions, and you started with a quote from a friend. And you said, "A friend of mine tartly reminded me, how could there be a contemporary art in Asia if it was either it's too provincial, or it's too derivative, or too one thing or the other? It doesn't seem possible that there would be such a thing as contemporary art in India, in this case." That was almost a whole history ago. And here we are, almost 20 years later. How do you see this trajectory of where Asian art, especially contemporary art, has come in? And how do you reflect on its perception in the United States?
Well, first of all, art criticism is really a matter of learning on the job, and you teach yourself in public, and you make mistakes, and that's just part of the job. And I had a tough time when I first was looking at contemporary Asian art myself, wading through these various issues. Is it borrowing Western forms? Is that invalid? Is it inauthentic? All these kinds of things, because I had a fixed idea in my mind of what Asian art should be.
Going back to the MFA.
Going back to the MFA, exactly. And I think that was what I ran up against. I was just sort of getting through that, working through that myself at that point, but I was running into it all the time. The people had that same problem. They couldn't make the leap from Asia to West, and they're confusing these various things. I think that's become easier just because we've seen so much now. In 1998, when you did the
Inside Out.
Inside Out China show, I think that too, people kind of stopped a bit. They saw that what they saw was Mao, and what they saw was young rebels in China who were, fighting the government, and that part of it appealed to Western sentiment. But I think a lot of people didn't see the Chinese, the depths of China in that art, and that's taken time. I'm not even sure people do now, actually, so much.
So partly we feel that actually just by seeing more, people actually can get to a deeper level.
I think so. And a variety too. I think it's important.
Right.
Yeah.
But how do you look at the notion of kind of cultural specificity and the depth that you were talking about? And if you were to, because you're so passionate about the younger writers and writers who are now coming into contemporary art, how do you encourage them to think about that notion of peeling the onion, if you will, to get at the specificity as well as the globality of the piece, if you will?
Well, I think their young critics are coming to it on their own already. When I was at Yale about a month ago, I had a group of people together, and I was astonished at how advanced their thinking was, a way that I was nowhere near when I was at that age. And they're still undergraduates, so there's a lot of advancement in that area, I think.
But I personally felt that one of the things that was very special about you is the fact that you had spent those times at the MFA, the fact that you had studied with Vidya, the fact that you knew something about the histories of these places, really provided a kind of sensitivity to the material that many people who come directly out of contemporary art were not able to see. Am I wrong in assuming that?
Well, I had some education in Asian art, so there was that. When I went to the Times, I got the distinct impression that they wanted me to be an Asian art critic, a non-Western critic, and I had to straighten them out on that very quickly and say, that would be bad for me, it would be bad for art, and it would be bad for the Times, so you can't do that. I've got to do the whole schmear, and so I did. But, and I'm a compulsive reader, so I was reading like crazy about that time. I consider every week's, basically, being an art critic for a daily newspaper is the same as being a student in school, like high school. You've got your weekly assignment, you do your homework, you do your research, then you've got to write this paper for your deadline. You hope you get an A, or at least an A for effort. Sometimes you do, most often you don't. And so it's like that, But it does force you to walk the walk as far as doing research goes.
And get that term paper out,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
Yeah. And get, Holland, in your opening remarks, there's two things that sort of registered on my mind. One is your reason to work at Africa. The other, the emphasis on language. To look at the Asian contemporary art, and so much of the language of critical writing is consciously or unconsciously in the context of a certain vocabulary developed in the criticism of the Western modern and contemporary art. And when we look at Asia, we either say East and West shall never meet, or East and West now should meet. Sort of a bipolar. But the world is certainly multipolar now, your work in Africa. So how do you address the new approach in today's world, look at Asian contemporary art, or what kind of a language that the art critic could possibly develop originated from their field work in Asia?
Well, I would like art criticism to really go wild with approaches to, I would like to bring poets into this. I'd like to bring scientists into this. I'd like to bring fiction writers into this. Many, many different kinds of people. I don't think there's any, and academics. I shouldn't put them last, but let's do that. Because there's a problem there. The academic language has become sort of routinized and professionalized, so that and people find it hard to read. But I think that there's a wide range of approaches that we're not even beginning to take with this stuff. And I'm hoping maybe this CAA panel will bring some of that in, and yeah, we'll see. But there's a lot out there that could be happening.
Yeah. Another follow-up question, since we're in the context of the Phantoms of Asia. So using that as example to get your advice about how to approach, to critique such an exhibition. The curator attempts to use spirituality as a common thread by which to weave the connections and the interactions among the past and the present. Also, weave the connections among the 30 also artists, their work together. So as a young art critic, how do you advise one should approach, or what are the different ways approach to critique such an exhibition?
Well, you mentioned spirituality, and I know that people have an allergy to that concept, which I don't share at all, actually. I've always seen art as among other things, a kind of a spiritual medium, and which to me simply means an awareness of mortality, of certain moods of transcendence, generosity.
Right. Don't you think that's partly also this kind of a contemporary criticism context, where the word spirituality immediately gives people some allergies, that it comes out of that particular context?
It does.
So,
and it's partly, I think, it's reaction to a lot of that talk about spirituality in the 40s, 50s, and so forth. We have a whole,
a lot started in San Francisco.
Yeah, that's true. But I have no problem with it at all. And I was talking to earlier this evening with somebody that Bob Thompson did a show at the Museum for African Art in Soho, which is then in Soho. And it was called Face of the Gods.
Which is a fabulous show.
Fabulous
show.
A mind blower.
Right.
And what he did was he constructed altars from various African cultures, including Afro-Caribbean cultures, in the museum, and in diorama-type displays, which museums of fine art usually don't use.
Right.
And he had some of these altars created by ritual specialists who from these religions. And part of the people came from the Bronx, from Brooklyn, from Queens, who were actually devotees of those religions and placed offerings on the altars. So you had the museum suddenly turned into this place of worship as well as a place of looking at art objectively. It was a wonderful, wonderful.
It's funny. I used that example when they asked me to come from Boston to think about the directorship at the museum, at the Asian Society. And I said, these are the kind of shows that Asian Society should be doing. And at that point, when Susan was there, the shows at the African Museum were just really quite thought-provoking for the same reason.
So, my advice would be just don't be afraid of the term spiritual. Just go with it, and read, look at it, think about it. Just take it as a given, and
Let me just follow up on Jay's question about the juxtaposition of traditional objects and contemporary objects. And what are the kind of things that you think become pitfalls And what are the things that you think work when you bring these objects from the past and then have something of our time together that you think young curators and critics should think about?
Well, I think many times there's the lookalike phenomenon where something resembles something else. You know, African resembles a medieval reliquary, something like that, and that's not sufficient. That's not enough. So I think it really becomes interesting when you bring these things together and explain how they functioned very, very similarly. If we followed Bob Thompson's lead at the Museum for African Art, we would be showing medieval reliquaries from France in a similar spirit, because that's exactly what they are.
Right.
They're the living, they were intended to be living things. Many of our sculptures in the Metropolitan Museum were meant to be living things.
Right.
And if you go to Japan sometime today, people will bow in front of a Buddha that's in a museum. So the idea of these charismatic objects is still alive in some cultures. It's just been kind of lost in our culture.
And yet what happens, it seems to me, is that we do that often with non-Western objects. But we don't always do that with Western objects in terms of that context. So that brings me to the question of context. And you mentioned that in your talk as well, that actually context matters. How do you think about context in contemporary art? And in your piece on African art recently, you talked a lot about the global phenomenon of artists who are seen in biennials and fairs and et cetera. And then there is the local context. How do you think about that idea of the local context of the art, its depth, but also its perception, and how it gets seen in the international market, if you will, or the international exhibition arena?
Well, I'm thinking of the Bamako photo biennial offhand, and one of the problems there is that in Bamako itself, it's considered a European show, even though all the artists in it are African. There's no local audience for it, although they tried Samuel Sidibe, who runs the National Museum in Mali, tried very hard to bring in a local audience by putting posters across the city and sponsoring musical performances and stuff like that at the museum. So people would come in for other reasons. But they really do see that whole phenomenon of the exhibition as not theirs. So that's a problem. It would make more sense, that show, here, actually, if it appeared. You know, it's funny, but it would. Even though photography is as African a medium as it is a Western medium. You know, it started about the same time in India, Africa, and Europe.
Exactly. Late 19th century,
mid-19th century, yeah. So it's no more a European than any other. But yeah, so it's hard for the Africans in that situation to see that art. Meanwhile, we demand of artists coming from Africa that they look African.
Right.
They have to give some signal that we are, of this other culture. And so that puts them in a bind, because, well, what do they have to do then? You know, always dress up funny, you know? And we just haven't gotten past that. We're still...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that notion of national identity outside of the country becomes so much more of a phenomenon than in the country, where in Africa or India or any of those places, you know, the Western engagement is 150 years old. It wasn't even their choice. Colonial experience brings you in.
The national identity for the people at home and abroad, they both have, but somewhat different.
Right.
Because their frame of reference is quite different. So I'd like to extend the question about context further. So for a young art critic, what kind of skill sets in terms of knowledge bases would they need in terms of be meaningfully critique the contemporary art development in Asia or in the international stage? One thing I noticed is that in the graduate school, nowadays there are a lot of graduate students focusing on contemporary art, relatively few on traditional Asian art, no matter which country. And so what's your comment on these phenomena and the question of what kind of knowledge base the young art critic need to have?
Well, I think it's a problem that right now that so many graduate students and young students are focusing on contemporary as opposed to traditional art, particularly in African art. I mean, we're losing a whole generation of field work because of this. There are reasons why it's difficult to study in Africa, political reasons. Languages are difficult to learn. There are a lot of things standing in the way of it. But the reality is that stuff is being lost, and it was true in India too.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
major monuments crumbling away, and they're not being documented, and they should be documented.
Right.
So I'm very strongly encouraging the trend to shift that trend, and you know, it seems to me in academic studies that it's a generational, things change. One generation rebels against the previous generation, so maybe the next generation, who are now in 7th grade or something.
Like a pendulum.
They go back to Shang bronzes, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's my hope.
But I always consider Sean Bronzes as utmost contemporary.
Oh, yeah.
So another question is that now looking at not that distant past, 30 years ago, what are the major trends in terms of contemporary art development in Asia that you observe?
In Asia
In
itself.
Asia, yeah. Or in the international stage, really, yeah.
Well, I think it's expanded the way that the entire art market has expanded. There's just the options have opened wide. There's all kinds of things going on, which is good. This is great. And nonetheless, the market still persists in picking 3 Asian artists, making them stars, and looking at nobody else.
Right.
One African artist and making him or her a star, and nobody else.
And then every museum that wants something
Yeah, it's
contemporary
just
African is the same artist, right?
Yeah.
That's the area I feel, the art criticism could play a very meaningful balancing influence.
I agree.
Because the market tend to focus on the winners and keep repeat the same winners. So they're really limiting to some extent what the artist should do or can do. But on the other hand, I think the broader stretch of art criticism could play a very meaningful role to make sure that the different divergent developments are sustained and encouraged.
Well, that was sort of in a way what you recently wrote about with the Frieze Art Fair. And I was very struck by a sentence you had in there, which was this notion of the representation of a Subodh Gupta and one person from here or there, but doing no more work to really do the hard work of going to India, to Africa, to Southeast Asia, to really learn what's going on.
Yeah.
And so the question I would have is also this idea of, now here we are 20-some years later, after this phenomenon was first burst on the international scene. I always remind people that in China, in India, in Japan, people knew there was stuff going on. It was only in the Western world that people didn't know. But it seems to me that we're at a point where the commercialization has so far outpaced where the scholarship is, that how do you think about that notion of what are the correctives that are needed, not just art criticism, but also in the museum world, that where are the areas that we need to really focus in on to say, it's not just about the stars who are seen in the same fairs and the same biennials across the board, but what else needs to be done?
Well, one thing was, 20 years ago, when multiculturalism was just kind of beginning to flourish, and we were talking about this earlier, actually, a critic, to maintain credibility, had to sort of get up to speed on art in other places besides New York.
Right.
You couldn't not do that. You had to do it. But that passed. Multiculturalism is no longer fashionable. And as soon as it was no longer fashionable, the interest in that kind of art dropped immediately. So you went to the Frieze Art Fair. Now you'll see almost nothing by non-Western artists.
Exactly.
It's astonishing, really, how you could do that, because but they did. And so I don't know how you can, I think, you can't force people to do it.
Right.
But dealers have lots and lots of money now. They can be very rich people. They could be going to these places. It would be, expenses not an issue. And they should be doing it. That's what I feel.
Right.
They should just go.
Well, it's interesting because you have the Hong Kong Art Fair that's about to open.
Right.
In fact, opening now. Now, Indian Art Fair is also getting picked up by the Art Basel people.
Right.
So it seems like it's the fairs that are determining where people are going to go. But then people just go to the fair.
Right.
They're actually not going beyond the fair
Right.
to go to a studio to learn something
Right.
more. So that's kind of an interesting thing.
I know. Well, what's the motivation really? Unless it's an altruistic one, I suppose you'd say.
Right.
Yeah, some of the fair, for example, in Hong Kong, they start to do a little bit more organizing the studio tours. I think that is an encouraging.
But see, that's where the
development. But-
museums
yes,
have to do it.
that's
And I
right.
think we all have to take that responsibility.
Exactly. So museum now, traditionally museum really focus on only dead artists. Right now we are very much in the living artist space. So I think this is the division of labor, if you will. Of course, not line drawing the sand, but to really encourage direct encounter with artists as something that I think we should do
Yeah,
more.
yeah. I think artists should be let loose in museums the way I was when I was a little kid, Do what you want.
Yes.
Here's the collection, it's yours, do what you want. I really think that should be happening more often than it does.
Yeah.
Good. In the spirit of doing whatever you want, I'm sure we can continue to talk forever. So maybe let's start to see if what kind of questions we have on the floor. So don't shy to raise your hands. This is your opportunity.
And microphones are
Yes.
around, yes? Yeah.
Yeah. There's a question in the front.
So you mentioned poetry as an early training for language. I'm a huge fan and a huge believer in that, in the specificity of words and the ability of words. I think all of this has to do with, Holland's message is how you say it. You come with a spirit of generosity. I think generosity is informed by knowledge. And deep knowledge. You can't be generous as a contemporary critic if you don't know a lot about what you're writing about. But I'm very curious to know how you would say that poetry has had an effect on the way that you have thought about language and the way that you write about things. I think that addresses spirituality too, by the way.
Yeah. Well, there's a tradition of poets being art critics. I think it's kind of a natural thing. John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, so forth and so on, for a long time. And I happen to love language myself as much as I love ideas. And I feel like it carries everything. So it's crucial to, that's the pleasure part of it for me. I write, we were talking earlier about this, but I write, and then when it comes to the revision, that very last draft, when you're fooling around with words and polishing phrases and choosing, that's the reward for me. That's the part I love.
And I can attest to that. I always enjoy Holland's language, his writing, to such a degree. Sometimes I worry about the content. Just enjoy the word.
Sure, I worry about it too. But it drives
Beautiful,
my
right? Very
thank you.
enjoyable.
It makes my editors absolutely insane. Because
Yeah,
there's
I
this,
know. How do you do that when you have deadlines? Oh my
they
God.
won't let me near the copy after a certain point. Don't give it to him because he's going to just, I can't stop. But and it's just this language thing. It's my own personal madness. He was important to me. He was a very patient teacher, and at the time I loved his poetry, and he also had an aspect to him that was of interest to me, which is that he was politically active in the 1960s, and that appealed to me a lot. It still does appeal to me a lot. I mean, I think that's an important factor. Let me put it that way. It's behind everything I write at some level, not like a Democrat, Republican political, but just that kind of morality, that sense of morality. I think.
And I think that's one of the things I've noticed about you is that when in the early 90s the multiculturalism debates were going on, you paid attention, partly because, in fact, your generosity of the belief in diversity as a very important thing that probably comes out of that kind of a sense of political activism.
I think.
That, as you were saying, you are what your life is.
Right.
And it shows up,
I
think it's
identified
interesting.
with that diversity. Yeah.
Another question here.
Thank you for your illuminating comments. Since you're a critic, When you look at a piece of art and you say you don't even know who the artist is, but the piece of work seems to transcend you, or it doesn't. What does or doesn't transcend you when you look at a piece of art to say that this artist is, part of the, regular stream, or someone who is you need to look for in the future, or really has done something, for the art world?
I think hard looking is sometimes what gives me a sense of investment in a work of art. I spend a lot of time with it, and the more time I spend, the more invested I feel in it. I have a little bit of trouble with transcendence in art. I'm always aware of the physical thing in front of me. I'm a little hesitant about very high kind of flown ideas about stuff. So I'm of two minds about it, basically. What I love is in art basically is ephemerality, immateriality. That's a feature of art that has always appealed to me. It doesn't have to be solid, and it in fact isn't solid. Nothing is solid. Everything is molecules flying apart, and I'm very aware of that underlying art that I look at and care about.
Hello.
Our winner.
Yes.
Thank you. Microphones make me really nervous. I, as an aspiring critic and an aspiring academic, I find myself struck by a sort of schizophrenia in my use of language. And as a byproduct of that, I have two questions, if I may ask. One has to do with how you handle, in discussing non-Western art, and specifically non-American art, the obligation to translate something about the culture of origin, which is something that I think I've noticed you've balanced very well with attentiveness to the object itself as a sort of stimulus of physical and intellectual engagement. So my first question is, how do you balance this sort of the burden of translation of something foreign to an audience here while still attending to the work? My second question is, what have you learned as a writer, as a critic, and as an individual from your relationships with working and living artists? Which is something, a dimension, I think, of criticisms, which is sometimes lost in the final product, but I think can be incredibly informative along the way.
Well, I love observing and working with living artists. I've learned so much. They have nothing to learn from me. I have everything to learn from them, and I know that they're the source. So the more I can experience that, the better. In every way, the thinking, the hands-on part, all of that. That immediate experience, there's nothing like it. It's invaluable. And I've mistranslated. It's always a risk. I can point to instances where I've tried to read into something content that was not in fact there. One of the things of being in the business for 30 years is you do get a sense of your track record, and so I can look back and I can see, oh boy, I was way off base talking about that particular piece, and that's happened more times than I would care to tell you, but I try to keep ahead of it by reading. It's what I spend all my time doing, basically.
Holland, is that particularly true if you reflect back on non-Western things because of sometimes a desire to look at something and attribute some culturally specific information to the piece?
Yeah. It is true. And there was a Steve McQueen video that several years ago that he did, and I saw. And I overread that piece in terms of racial politics. He didn't intend it to be about racial politics, but I was that's where I wanted it. That's what I wanted it to be. So I was wrong. I was just wrong on that. That taught me a lesson. Okay, I've got to step back, and find out how much is me and how much am I actually looking objectively what's going on here. And the only way I could find out whether I'm looking objectively then is to do some reading, ask some questions, which I did. That's how I found out I was wrong.
Yeah, Holland, I dare to differ a little bit when you say that you only learn from the artists as sources. And I think you certainly had the impact on the artists, those that you care to comment on or to critique. And maybe not only artists, maybe the museum professional as well, and we have a living example, which is Vishakha. I think one of your early pieces, your 1993 piece about Vishakha's effort in the Asian Society to create the contemporary art program. So maybe my question to Vishakha, on the receiving end, what that piece did to you.
Wow, that was a long time ago.
Long time, yeah.
Wow, 1993. I have to say, the thing is, I was telling Chung Lee, the thing that was most amazing about that piece is that you don't even know this, but the amount of letters I got from young Asian American artists and Asian Americans to say they had never seen a big piece written about an Asian American woman in the New York Times. And that in itself was more important than anything else. And then, of course, there were artists who were saying, can I do a show with you? Sure. So, this is true, too. But the power of the paper, I mean, often people say the New York Times is sort of like it's a one-paper town, the whole country is, that it's in the New York Times, the world pays attention. And it's very interesting. I mean, it's so powerful. Now, who knows with online and everything else, that'll be a different matter. But so far, so good.
Right.
Now the art practical is coming up.
Exactly.
Yes.
Questions over there? Yes? Hugo, over there?
It's two Christies. Who's going to fight it out?
Holland, within all the research, how much do you let a work of art speak to you? And if all art is always contemporary, the artist's voice isn't always there to speak for the work if he's passed away. And how important is intuition in all of this, with all the cerebral academia and all the knowledge we put into it? There's something about intuition always there, that a feeling, a sensitivity.
I think it's very important, and I respond strongly to the physical presence of objects. I always have since I was a kid. I think it was my mother, actually, as I mentioned, during that collecting that she did. It really tuned me into these objects that she found beautiful, and therefore I looked at them and through her eyes, and I found them beautiful. So I've had an early sense of it. And also the weight of objects, which we never rarely get to experience. But it was at Asia Society, before you were there, I worked as a docent for one.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I did. The deal was I would work as a docent there for a semester or whatever it was, if they would let me do some hands-on stuff. So it was the Rockefeller South Asian collection that was going to be put on view. So I went backstage there. They took all that stuff out of storage, put it in one room, and they let me carry this stuff around. So I actually, for the first time, I felt what
the weight of Chola bronze.
Yeah, Chola bronze.
Oh my God.
Exactly.
Yes.
Blew my mind. I couldn't
Right.
believe it. So it was like a truly electric experience. I've never forgotten it.
Right.
So I relate to art on that level.
So, Holland, I hope you will never retire from your job, but if you ever do, come to us as a docent.
I'll be
We
happy
will
to.
find a place for you. So, yeah, there's a question in the very back. Oh, the lady. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Get back to you. Yeah.
First of all, as a student of art history in the 90s, I have to say thank you for writing on Indian art, specifically in the New York Times, because it was so inspiring for us to see you doing reviews on every show that both Specia did, or even shows that Kazuko did downtown in Lower East Side with Japanese artists. And so it was very inspiring to see someone writing and giving some daylight to Asian art when nobody actually was even looking at Asia. So And my question today is, having grown in India and America through these rapid changes that the country is going through, we're always questioning about this anxiety of influence. Like, when do we stop talking about Western influence on Asian contemporary art? If you go to India, every gap of 5 years, you see the mall culture. You can't keep up with it. As having lived in India, I can't keep up with it. So as an art critic, how do you see it every time you write something about China or India or Southeast Asian art?
Well, yeah, the internet has been a godsend. It really has, because at least you can get images of a kind you could never get before. If you just go onto certain websites, you can scan things and to get a little sense of what's going on. But also, I've made some connections with art dealers and artists in India and in China, and so I have that too. And email is great, you know. So that's the way I do it, because I can't travel to those places frequently. I'm trying to maintain those contacts in Africa now, but it's difficult because the internet connections they come and go, and you know, there's cities. Bamako doesn't have electricity for half the day, so it's really hard to communicate with people. What I'm trying to do is keep that up too. That's the only way I can do it, is through these electronic social media. You know, they do have some uses.
This question is actually an open question to all three panelists. It seems, I'm actually a translator and I translate between Chinese and English, so I'm very interested in the previous questions about translation and context. But more specifically, it seems that there's already an international dialogue when it comes to art, but I'm curious, do you see the emergence of an international dialogue when it comes to criticism? Do you read criticism written by Chinese critics or academics or Indian critics? And, you know, is there like a flow both ways, or is it really primarily going one direction?
Well, commercial break again. ACAC, the International Association of Art Critics, was put together precisely for this reason. So our meetings are annually in different countries across the world. Samuel Sidibe, who's the director of the National Museum in Mali, was one of our presidents for quite a while. And we try to get that international stuff going, and they do publish a newsletter which lets you keep up on what's going on across the world. I try to read, but translation is a problem, and you know, I don't read Asian languages, so I don't have access to stuff that isn't translated. But I try to keep up, and I try mostly through talking.
Related to my earlier question to Holland, my view is still one-dimensional in terms of the language of art criticism that I observe. I'm myself not an art critic. I'm a museum director, a former curator, but based on what I read and work in the field, that I feel that way. I think, but hope is there, as Holland pointed out, 30 years ago to now, the contemporary Asian art is everywhere. The magnitude of the presence, the truth is there. I think it's all up to you, young art critic, to make the original scholarship in terms of art criticism,
But
I would call it.
I do think that it's very important to actually think about this question. When we first started doing contemporary Asian art exhibitions, we very strategically thought about who was going to be the curator. So it was not by accident that the first curator of the first show we did was Apinan Poshananda from Thailand, who was trained at Cornell, lived in Thailand, because I wanted to make sure that that inside-outsider perspective was very much there, or Gao Ming Lu for Inside Out. So it wasn't just somebody parachuting in for 3 weeks, going into a country and trying to get that thing done. So I think part of it is how to get different voices to come, not just for art criticism, but also for curatorship. So it's very important that Mami is doing the show for you here, you know? And I think that, at least from Indian perspective, I can tell you that writers like Geeta Kapoor have had a lot of influence on how contemporary Asian art or Indian art is perceived. But it's because the language is easy. It's all written in English, whereas from Chinese side, that becomes more of a problem. Yeah. On the other hand, the popular criticism in India in newspapers is pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic. So you have to go to some magazines and other places. So you also have to think about what is the source. Just because something comes from a country doesn't necessarily mean that it is A, authentic, B, any good. So you still have to raise the same questions of quality of writing and quality of criticism.
Yeah, in that corner. And the next question is the lady in front of you.
Thank you. I just wonder if you might comment a moment about the work you did, which was honored by the Pulitzer Committee in retrospect, the pieces you did about the Chinese artists.
Right. Technically, the award, in my case, was given to a body of work rather than those particular series of pieces. That's just the way they gave it. But the series that I did in China, it was a four-part series. I'd gone there just before the Summer Olympics in 2008, and pretty much do the same thing I did in Africa, which is try to divide up the kind of things I saw, contemporary art as well as ancient art, historical art. And so and culture. I mean, I can't really separate culture from art in these cases. I had to do the whole thing. Like in Africa, I mean, it was as important to me to go out when I was out in the countryside in Ivory Coast to visit a clinic run by a doctor there who was working with traditional herbal medicines as well as with Western medicines to cure epilepsy. And so people came from miles and miles around for a cure from him and lived in his clinic. That was one of the high points of my trip there. And it was I can't separate that out from the intense healing atmosphere at Lalibela in Ethiopia, that religious atmosphere. It's all one thing to me. So, and in China, I try to do the same thing, to meet with scholars, meet with artists, meet with, and then try and put it together. It's the writing part is the hard part, because there's so much information out there. Africa was hell to write about, because I felt like I had tons and tons of information. I didn't know how to synthesize it into 1,200 words that would actually be comprehensible to somebody riding a subway to work in the morning, which is the bottom line for writing a Times piece. Anyway,
I believe there's a question just right in front of you, the woman who, oh no? Okay, yeah, in that side there.
His hand right here.
In your opening remarks, you made some very favorable comments about the concept of Phantoms of Asia. And I'd like to know precisely what your process for critiquing this show will be.
By the way, she is a docent.
I'll talk to you. I don't know the answer to that yet. I'll see you tomorrow morning. But my comment was on the concept of the show. I was particularly putting in the context of the Metropolitan Museum's move to the current Whitney space, and what are they going to do with that? I wrote a piece in the Times recommending that they combine old and new art, that they don't give it over to
all contemporary.
Do something with this, interesting. And I'm hoping that this show, it sounds to me like it's the kind of interesting thing that I would hope they would do. I'll find out tomorrow, but...
The jury is out.
The jury's out.
Yeah. Yes, that gentleman.
Could you just pass this down?
You were talking earlier about multiculturalism, and as a grad student in the 90s, multiculturalism was the mother's milk I was drinking. I wonder if you have a view on the difference between multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. Because it seems to me like there's a new feeling in the contemporary art world, and in some ways very related, but perhaps distinct. Do you see those relations, or, do you have any ideas on that subject?
I actually wrote a piece for the Sundays section of the Times at the time that Thelma Golden did her first big group show at the Studio Museum in Harlem.
The Post-Black.
The Post-Black, yeah. That was, and she
yeah.
announced that this was Post-Black art. And I did a piece for the Times at that point saying maybe multiculturalism is over and we're moving on to cosmopolitanism. That's what we're coming to now. But without saying that that's exactly what was happening, because there are problems with post-Black too. Mm-hmm. So so I just had to sort of say, well, here we've moved a step, but it's not a definitive step. And this is still being sorted out, and I think it is still being sorted out. Although multiculturalism has fallen into disfavor, it can still be argued for in some ways.
Do you feel that part of the issue, and I wonder if that's where you're getting at, is that often when people think cosmopolitanism, it's as if you're transcending the specificity of a place or a culture.
Right.
But when we think about multiculturalism,
Right.
it's all about specificity.
Right.
And it seems to me that the either-or is problematic.
Yeah.
Because things are both about connectivity and specificity.
Right.
And how do we understand those two, it seems to me, is one of the challenges of our time. And how do you pick it apart so you understand what is specific? It's sort of like I often say that people look at me wearing Western clothes, and I've lived here for more than 45 years, and I sound as if I'm an American. But there's a whole lot of stuff about me that's not that. Sure. And those layerings are still important. So it's, I think, partly that notion of, does cosmopolitanism mean the art fairs where everything is the same and it's homogeneity? Or what is that specificity that keeps coming out? Sometimes it's a barrier, and sometimes it's enrichment. And how do we understand that? It seems to me that's one of the issues.
Yeah, I think we understand it just as you've described it, actually. There's no real solution there.
Exactly.
And the market is invested in branding, so you're going to get branded one way or the other.
Right.
And it's not going to want to deal with that kind of mushy area there in between. So that's what art criticism is for and what art history is for.
Right.
To deal with exactly those things.
It's a liminality of place.
Because, Edwin Denby, this critic Edwin Denby, who you probably know, dance critic. I love dance critics. This is my favorite criticism, actually. Edwin Denby said, an art critic is somebody who has nothing to sell. And that's exactly what an art critic should be. You're not, going to you're not going to be paid for this, having this opinion. You're going to be able to float free, look at it both ways, look at it all ways. And I hope that's...
Music criticism is also interesting. It seems to me that the notion of world music had been around a lot longer than the contemporary art from the West, in a non-Western world. Mm-hmm. And music critics picked up on that long ago, and they wrote about both the subtlety of specific nuance, but also part of the larger world. And it's an interesting question,
So on the note of there's no solutions, and I'm a believer in being punctual, so maybe before we dismiss ourselves, let's ask Holland, is there any concluding remarks you would like to share with the audience?
No.
Okay. What about Vishakha?
No, I'm just thrilled to, I said to Holland that here we are both New Yorkers, we have to come all the way to San Francisco to see each other.
Good. So in a way, the New York come to San Francisco, right?